Let's learn how to read and study the Bible together in Hebrews chapter 3. We are in verse 4 in this episode. And so if you've been tracking with us, you know we've gone through chapter 1 and 2. And so here we find ourselves in verse 4. We're going to read it, and hopefully by the end of today, you'll have some helpful Bible study skills added to your tool belt. Your current skills will be developed more. At the end of this, I just want you to learn how to read and study the Bible better. I want to be a benefit to you. So, with my kids yelling in the background, hopefully we can get through this. It says, "For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God." Now, this is what a lot of people do when they study the Bible sometimes, is they'll start their morning devotionals or jump in a random place in Scripture, and they just start where they haven't even understood what's been said prior to it. And so essentially they begin to read something isolated from its context. So tip number 1, read things in context, meaning understand what comes before and after this verse. For instance, the author of Hebrews in chapter 3 has set forth this idea that Jesus is the high priest and apostle of our faith. And he's the one that's been faithful as a son appointed by God versus Moses, who was faithful in God's house. And so we have a contrast going on between Jesus and Moses. Moses being faithful in God's house, Jesus being over God's house, right? And a son in the house of God, the family of God. And Jesus is counted of more worthy than Moses because Jesus is the builder and Moses is just a part of the household, right? So Moses is not the builder of the family and the household of God. Jesus is. And that argumentation is going to continue into verse 4. So this is why we read things in context, because verse 4 is going to fit into the main argument of chapter 3 that Jesus is actually better than Moses. He's superior to Moses, which means he brings something better than what Moses does. That's why the word "for" is what starts this verse here in verse 4. It says "for." In other words, everything that's been said in verse 1, 2, and 3 is about to be elaborated on or proven, right, or expounded on here in verse 4. This is going to be a part of the argument. "For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God." So what we need to figure out as good Bible students is, how does verse 4 make sense of verse 3? Or how does verse 4 relate to verse 3? And of course you can zoom out even more and go, how is this whole chapter related to verse 4? How is the whole letter to the Hebrews related to verse 4? And you can zoom out as much as you want, but for sake of time, let's just go to verse 3. It talks about how Jesus is more worthy of glory, or worthy of more glory than Moses, as much as the degree of glory here between Jesus and Moses is likened to the difference between the builder of the house and the house itself. The house is impressive, but what's more impressive is the one who built the house, right? So how does verse 4 and 3 connect? Well, think about the words that are being used. Part of the way you connect when you study the Bible, you connect verses together, is by keeping tabs on any repeating words, any repeating ideas, or any synonyms of other words. So for instance, what we have here, let me just highlight it in yellow so you guys don't get confused. We have the builder of a house, right? And we already highlighted how the word house is used several times in verse 3 and 4, and 2, to let us know the household, the family of God, is what is in focus here, right? But there are ideas that the author is making that relate to the house, or ideas he's putting forth that relate to the house. So here we see the builder of a house is more honorable than the house itself. Every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. So just in verse 3 and 4, right, we see the builder, the one who builds, and what's being built. I just want to pay attention to that because the word house is used 3 times, and of course there's no numerical value here, significance to how many times they're used. Just the point is the house is emphasized and the one who builds the house is emphasized. That's how verse 4 connects to verse 3. Because when you study the Bible, think about how, if you've been reading Hebrews chapter 3, you would know that certain words have been repeating so far. One of those words is the word house, like I said, right? So I want to keep tabs on that when I study the Bible, and I want to think about or be on the lookout in verse 4 for any other instances of the word house, right? Or if I start to see this theme of a builder being developed, I want to take note of that, and then in the next few verses, I want to be on the lookout for any words relating to building or a builder or something being built, right? So the way verse 3 and 4 connect is that the house is built by someone and God is the one who builds all things, right? How does this relate to verse 3? Because think about how Jesus has more glory than Moses. the difference in glory between Jesus and Moses is the difference in glory between a house and the builder of the house. So who is the builder of the house being put forth in verse 3 as being worthy of more glory? It's Jesus. And then verse 4, it says the builder of all things is God. So here we have God and his son building a house, a family, a household, right? That Moses is a faithful steward and servant in, but Jesus is better, right? So this word but lets me know this is emphasizing something new, or the sentence is taken on a new direction. We're talking about how every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now that's going to be something I want to pay attention to and go, why does he emphasize that the builder of all things is God? Have I seen any ideas related to that put forth in 3 verses before this, or in this chapter? Do I see any ideas connected to the concept of God building all things? Now we get to verse 5, with my daughter throwing a tantrum in the background. It says, now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant. Okay, this word now is letting you know that what I'm about to say is going to be a kind of argument relating to the points he's already made in the previous verses. Every house is built by someone. That's cool, but you need to know this. The one who builds all things is God, right? And Moses was faithful in God's house as a servant, not as a builder. That's very important, okay? So what I want to do is note there have been several statements made about Moses, right? And if you just read 1, 2, 3, and 4, you know that, right? So as a Bible student, what I want to do is maybe list that out somewhere, or maybe like underline that Moses is faithful, because there are several descriptions of Moses, several characteristics of Moses that actually play into the main point of this text. The reason I know to pay attention to that is because Moses keeps coming up, and since the author is using Moses to, emphasize the greatness of Jesus, I want to pay attention to what's being said about Moses and list that out. So what we have here is a list developing. Moses was faithful in God's house, right? Moses is worthy of less glory than Jesus because he was, a part of the house itself. Moses was faithful in God's house. Moses is a servant. And these different descriptions of Moses and characteristics that the author is intentionally highlighting play into the point that he's making. So when you read the Bible, what you want to do is try and figure out the main point of that section, the main point of that passage or that verse. And part of the way we do that is by recognizing any developing list. This can be a list of characteristics, a list of people, a list of events, a list of cross-references or statements. So pay attention to the fact that there seems to be, in every verse 2, 3, 4, there's something said or compared to Moses, So Moses is faithful in all God's house as a servant. And since I see the word house again, what I usually do is I'll just circle that, highlight it, and then I'll just draw arrows to every other instance that I see that. The reason I do this is because I want to keep tabs on not only the repeating words, but what the repeating words are emphasizing about this text. Not just that this is about a household and this is about a family, but specifically there's something about the household that's being highlighted. There's something about the family of God that's being highlighted. And Moses and Jesus are a part of that equation, right? So Moses is faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. So the rest of verse 5 essentially explains what it means that Moses is a faithful servant. So, another tip I have for people is learn to ask the right questions. And part of the way you do that is just by asking questions in general. So I go, Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant. I want to pause there and go, what does it mean that Moses was faithful as a servant? What did he do? Who did he serve? How did he serve? In what way was he faithful? These are questions I should have and not just assume I understand what's being said. Because as I read on, those questions actually get answered. How is Moses a faithful servant? Specifically, what the author of Hebrews wants to highlight for us is that he testified to the things that were to be spoken of later. So then a question I have is, what are the things that were to be spoken of later. And as I keep reading, maybe that question will be answered. As I keep reading the rest of Hebrews and the rest of the chapter, maybe that question will get answered. Another question I have is, what does it mean to testify? Like in the Greek, what's the word here translated? Testify. So I'll put like meaning, question mark. What's the meaning of this? And then note in verse 6, but. Remember, so he's talking about Moses. And so this word but notes a contrast, a transition, a change in direction when it comes to the thoughts and ideas. So we were talking about Moses, but Christ. So now who's he talking about? Jesus. And since I've already, my kids, since I've already seen Jesus and Moses compared to each other, I can take that information and then use that to help make sense of verse 6. So what I would probably do is, hey, since he's bringing in Jesus, I wonder if he's comparing Jesus and Moses in another way. But Christ is faithful over God's house as a son. Okay, so Moses is brought up as one who's faithful in God's house. Jesus is brought up as one who is faithful over God's house. So when you see the word but, clearly noting a contrast and clarifying the differences between something, you want to ask, what about those two things are different? What about Jesus and Moses is being contrasted? What about them is being highlighted as a difference? Well, specifically, Jesus is faithful over God's house. Moses is faithful in God's house. So I might ask the question, what does it mean for Jesus to be faithful over God's house or his family, his household? What does it mean for Moses to be faithful in it? Well, he's testifying to the things that were to be spoken of later. So the question that I had earlier right here, what things? I want to put a pin there, like on Google Maps, you put a pin somewhere. So I want to put a pin there and hold on to that question, hoping that it's going to get answered as I keep reading, right? But note the similarities between Christ and Moses. They're both faithful. They both have a part to play in the house of God. But also, how was Moses referred to? Moses was referred to as a servant. Now, that does not mean that Jesus didn't serve and he wasn't considered a servant, but what the author of Hebrews highlights about Jesus is that he's a son. So, what I would do, since I'm seeing a contrast, I'm seeing two things being compared, I would note the difference. So let's just take Moses and Jesus. Okay, I'll draw a line down. What's the differences between the two, right? He's faithful in God's house. Jesus is faithful over God's house. Moses is a servant. And you can do this in your Bible. Do it in your notes. Do it on a piece of paper, right? And Jesus is a son, right? They're both faithful, right? They're both faithful, and they both have a position in God's, or a connection to the house of God. So by actually just listing this out and actually following what the text is leading us to discover, I can begin to make sense of what this passage is about. And again, here we see God's house being referenced again, right? So since I see the word house being repeated over and over, that tells me that this passage has a lot to do with the house of God, and it involves Jesus and it involves Moses, but they're different, though they have similarities. Now we'll get to this last part, and we are his house in the next Bible study walkthrough, but I want you to know about something. We have a completely free 40-day Bible study program that is self-paced, meaning you can go fast, you can go slow, you can go average. It's 40 days of deep Bible study and learning and education, and if you want that, it's free. It's linked in the description below. If that's too much, you can take the 27-day program or the 11-day program. It's all free, and on our website at abovereproachministry.com. All right, that's all I have for you guys today. I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough.